Hey friends, welcome to Sabbath School Daily, where we have been studying from this lesson right here, Ephesus. We are on the first week of this quarter, which has the title, Paul and the Ephesians. Today is Monday's lesson, and the title is A Riot in the Amphitheater. So today's lesson revolves around the story that I mentioned yesterday that comes from Acts chapter 19, whereas when the city is disrupted, when the Ephesians perceive, and this comes through a man called Demetrius, the city is disrupted by the preaching of Paul, and so what happens next is that there's a big riot where Demetrius he takes his fellow craftsmen that used to make idols to Diana, and they get super angry at Paul because he is disrupting their service, he's disrupting their income, right, their livelihood. And they go to the theater of the city and they start crying out and accusing Paul, and finally, in a big frenzy, they call, Diana is the goddess of Ephesus. Diana is the goddess of Ephesus, right? Great is Diana of the Ephesians. That appears in verse 28 of chapter 19. So the story is there that Paul has a great obstacle here in the city, because since it's an extremely pagan city, it's very difficult to go in. My wife and I, we had the privilege of going to this city, like I mentioned yesterday. And unfortunately, we didn't see this temple, the temple of Artemis. I don't know if it's because it's not there anymore. It's in a completely different section from where we walked. I remember walking down this road. The end of it was the library, this beautiful library. But the temple of Artemis was the main attraction of the city in those times. The lesson describes it. It was a beautiful structure composed of 127 pillars, each of them 60 feet high. It's very common for you to see these pillars in Turkey, in modern day Turkey, even today. In many of the cities that you go, you'll see some of these pillars around, and they're gorgeous, beautiful, tall. It's incredible to imagine that they made these things 2,000 years ago. So that was the main attraction of the city. And so here is Paul preaching to these people, to the Gentiles there, to the Greco-Roman world, fourth largest city in the Roman Empire, the capital of Asia. And so he's disrupting their business, and so they start rioting against him. And so he has to go through that. Finally, everything kind of calms down because of a clerk that defends Paul. So this is really an invitation for you to read Acts chapter 19 and to see the situation that ensues over there. But Paul's ministry was one full of challenges. Wherever he went, he was faced with opposition. It's no different in Ephesus, which is why as well Paul is writing to the Ephesians, and he's encouraging them not to give up, because not only is Paul's ministry one that is surrounded by plots and twists and ups and downs, but the churches that he left behind in these cities, they also face persecution. They face the heresies that are coming from within the church itself. So it was a very difficult situation for them. And so that's the story. I'm not going to go into detail. This is meant for you to read. I just want to stimulate, to encourage you to read your lesson and read the verses that are mentioned there. But the lesson also mentions a timeline of events, a chronology of events regarding Paul and his contact with his connection to the Ephesians. So you have in AD 52, you have Paul's initial brief visit to Ephesus, and you'll see that in Acts chapter 18, verse 18 through 21. Then AD 53 through 56, Paul's 3-year permanence or ministry in Ephesus. That appears in Acts chapter 19, verse 1 through chapter 20, verse 1. And he composes, one thing that's interesting is that he composes 1 Corinthians during this time. One thing that's interesting is that we know that 1 Corinthians, as we have it in the Bible, it's actually the second letter that Paul writes to the city of Corinth. And interestingly enough, the second book of Corinthians, as we have it in the Bible, is actually the fourth letter that Paul writes to the city of Corinth. So we don't have the true first and third letters of that Paul writes to the church in Corinth. We have the second and the fourth, and those appear in the Bible as 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and just because we don't have the other letters. And we know that these letters exist because Paul references these letters in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And so in the city of Ephesus is where Paul writes his first letter to the Corinthians near the end of his stay there. So that's just an interesting fact right there. And then in AD 57, while at Miletus, Paul he meets with the elders from Ephesus, and that appears in Acts chapter 20, and he has a whole conversation with them. He encourages them. He says that he has preached to them with tears in his eyes, right? And I believe that he does that mainly because he knows everything that they're going through and everything that they're going to go through. So he's urging them to convert, to dedicate their lives to Christ. That appears in Acts chapter 20, verse 31, where he says, "Therefore watch and remember that for 3 years I did not cease to warn everyone night and day with tears." And that tells us a lot about the urgency of Paul's life. We see in Paul a man that did not waste time. He was extremely intentional in his ministry, intentional in his expensive time, intentional in his relationships, because he knew that time was short. He knew that the enemy was working rapidly, and that he had to, with urgency, night and day, with tears in his eyes, urge and encourage, and in his own words here, warn everyone. So that just tells you a little bit about Paul. And then finally, in AD 62, we have Paul composing his letter to the Ephesians, probably from the confinement in Rome. So here we see Paul most likely in jail, in prison, writing to the Ephesians, encouraging them through this book. So you see, again, this speaks to the character of this man, that even in jail, even imprisoned, facing who knows what on a day-to-day basis, he is encouraging this church in Ephesus. So that all of that together, it really goes to show, Paul is one of the men that I admire most in history, right? Second to Jesus only, Paul was a warrior of God. So, I encourage you to read this book. It's beautiful. Study your lesson today, especially the book. I don't want to go too much into the story for a few reasons. First of all, because I want you to read the story. I want you to go through the details of the story, understand what's going on, look at the details of the lesson mentioned. So I do want you to do that. And also, it's a very big story. I wouldn't be able to read the whole story and then then go break it down with you. So that's why these recaps of the lesson on our Sabbath School Daily, they serve only to truly encourage you to study your lesson. This isn't meant to substitute the lesson. There's no substitute to a good 30-minute, 40-minute devotional with the Lord, sitting down, studying, reading, praying. That will help you immeasurably. Please remember to share, to like, to subscribe to our videos. We release one every day, and I hope to see you again here tomorrow for another study at Sabbath School Daily.